The letter hit the floor of Georgia Donnelly's shop like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples it sent through her chest nearly knocked the breath from her body. Abel Barnett was leaving Caldwell, Kansas. Not just leaving. Gone. Already saddled up, already pointed west toward the open territory of New Mexico, already riding away from everything they had built together in the last 4 months without so much as a knock on her door. She had found out from the mercantile owner, Hector Briggs, who had seen Abel loading his saddlebags at first light, his jaw set like iron, his eyes carrying that hollow, dangerous look she had come to recognize as the wall he built between himself and anything that threatened to matter to him. And she was standing in her shop, her hands shaking so badly that the needle she had been holding dropped and rolled under the cutting table, and she was looking at that letter and thinking that she had seen this coming. She had seen the signs of a man preparing to run long before he knew himself that he was going to do it. She had seen it in the way he stopped sitting beside her at Sunday supper, in the way his eyes sometimes went distant and cold in the middle of a conversation, like he was already somewhere else, already gone, already choosing the road over everything that had begun to feel like home. What he did not know, what he could not possibly know, was that Georgia Donnelly had not been sitting idle. She had not been waiting for him to save her, to choose her, to stay. She had been working. She had been planning. She had been sewing something far more intricate than the finest silk dress she had ever crafted, something so carefully constructed that every thread of it was already set in place long before Abel Barnett decided the road was safer than love. She picked the letter up from the floor, unfolded it with hands that steadied by sheer force of will, and she read his words, clipped, honest in the brutal way of a man who thought honesty was the same thing as cruelty. He wrote that he was not a man who stayed. He wrote that she deserved better than a drifter with no name worth giving and no roots worth planting. He wrote that he was sorry. Georgia Donnelly read that word sorry, and something inside her that had been soft went very, very hard. She set the letter down on her cutting table, smoothed it flat with her palm, and she walked to the window of her shop and looked out at the wide main street of Caldwell, where the dust was still settling in the place where his horse had passed that morning. She breathed once, slowly, deliberately, the way she had learned to breathe in the years after her mother died and her father drank himself into uselessness, and she had been left at the age of 17 with a needle, a thimble, a borrowed sewing machine, and nothing but her own 2 hands and her own fierce mind to build a life from. She thought about the contract she had quietly arranged 3 weeks ago with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. She thought about the name she had quietly spoken in the ear of Marshall Douglas Webb. She thought about the deed she had quietly secured to the parcel of land on the south edge of town that backed up to the creek, the land that Abel had once stood looking at for a long, silent moment with something close to longing on his face. And Georgia Donnelly, seamstress of Caldwell, Kansas, in the year of our Lord 1879, smiled a small, fierce, private smile. She had already sown his future. He just did not know it yet. But to understand how it all came together, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the October afternoon when Abel Barnett first rode into Caldwell with his coat torn at the shoulder seam, his expression closed as a locked safe, and his eyes the color of a winter sky right before the snow decides to fall. The cattle season had just closed, and Caldwell was swollen with trail hands who had come up the Kishom Trail flush with pay, and ready to spend every cent of it on whiskey, card games, and a good time before the cold settled in for real. The town in the fall of 1879 was a raw, loud, dangerous place, one of the last wide-open cattle towns along the Kansas line before the railroad started pulling the trade further west. It had 3 saloons, 2 hotels of questionable character, a proper church, a bank that had already been robbed twice, a marshal's office, a mercantile, a livery, a doctor's office, and Georgia Donnelly's dress and tailoring shop, which sat between the doctor and the mercantile on the east side of Main Street with its freshly painted sign and its neat curtained windows. Georgia had come to Caldwell 2 years earlier with her younger brother Patrick, who was 19 and built like a fence post, and convinced that Kansas cattle country was where a young man with a strong back and a good disposition could make something of himself. Georgia had come because Patrick needed looking after, and because St. Louis had nothing left to offer her except the memory of a childhood that had been more work than childhood ought to be, and because she had heard that a woman with real skill and a strong business sense could do well in a frontier town where there was far more need than supply. She had been right. Her shop was the only quality tailoring establishment within 60 miles in any direction, and within 6 months she had more work than she could manage alone. She hired a young Mexican woman named Consolacion Rios, who had clever hands and a sharp eye for color and fit, and together they ran a business that served everyone from the cattle barons' wives who came in from their ranches outside of town for dress fittings, to the cowboys who needed their trail clothes mended before they could appear decent in public again. Georgia herself was 24 years old that October. With dark auburn hair she wore pinned up severely because loose hair caught on things when you were working, and green eyes that missed nothing, and a mind that operated 3 steps ahead of any conversation she was having. She was tall for a woman of her time, and she moved through her shop with the kind of unhurried efficiency of someone who had long since made peace with the fact that there was always more work to do, and panic never made it go faster. She was in the middle of cutting a bolt of blue wool into the pattern pieces for a winter coat ordered by Lydia Harmon, wife of the biggest cattle buyer in the county, when the bell above her shop door rang, and she looked up without setting down her shears. The man who came through the door had to turn sideways to manage it without his shoulders catching the frame, and that was the first thing she noticed. The second thing was the torn seam at the left shoulder of his canvas coat, split right along the stitching line in a clean break that told her it had gone on too long without reinforcement and finally given way under load. The third thing was his face, and the face was something else entirely. Strong jaw, square and set, a week's worth of dark stubble, a straight nose that had been broken at least once and healed slightly off-center, and those eyes, pale gray-blue, the kind of eyes that looked like they had seen too much of the world and decided the best response was to feel as little of it as possible. He stood in the doorway of her shop looking slightly out of place among the bolts of fabric and the dress forms and the smell of beeswax and thread, the way a wolf looks slightly out of place in a parlor, not aggressive exactly, but very clearly built for a different kind of territory. "I was told you do repairs," he said. His voice was low and carried the flat, careful tones of a man who chose his words the way other men chose their footing on uncertain ground. "I do," Georgia said. She set her shears down and came around the cutting table and looked at the shoulder seam with a professional eye, without touching him, just looking. "That needs more than a simple repair. The fabric itself is worn thin at the stress point. If I just restitch it, it will tear again in the same place within a month." He looked at her steadily. "What do you recommend?" "Let me reinforce the whole shoulder with a gusset. It will hold for years. I can have it done by tomorrow morning." Something flickered in his eyes, not quite surprise but close to it, as if he had expected a simpler answer and was momentarily recalibrating. "How much?" he asked. 25 cents for the simple repair, 60 cents for the gusset and full reinforcement." He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather coin purse without hesitation. "The second one," he said. "I work in this coat." She took his money and wrote his name in her order book, Abel Barnett. She asked him where he was staying in case the coat was not ready when he expected, and he told her the Drover's Rest, which was the more respectable of the 2 hotels, which told her something too, though she could not have said precisely what. He left and she stood at her cutting table for a moment looking at his name in her book before she went back to Lydia Harmon's coat. He came back the next morning and she had the coat done and waiting. She had done more than the gusset. She had reinforced both shoulder seams, replace two of the buttons with proper brass ones because the originals were cracked and ready to go, and run a line of double stitching along the right cuff where the hem was beginning to fray. She had not charged him extra for any of it. He put the coat on and worked the shoulder experimentally, a rolling, testing motion, and she watched his face change. It was subtle. The kind of change you would miss if you were not watching closely, and Georgia Donnelly was always watching closely. Something in the set of his jaw loosened fractionally. He ran his thumb along the cuff stitching without looking down at it, a purely tactile inspection, and then he looked at her. "You did more than I asked for," he said. "I did what it needed," she said simply. He studied her for a moment with those pale eyes, and she looked back at him without any particular expression, the way she had learned to look at difficult customers and difficult situations, calm and direct and giving nothing away. "What do I owe you for the extra work?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. The condition of the rest of the coat made the shoulder repair look worse by comparison. "I fixed what needed fixing." He was quiet for a beat longer than was comfortable. "Nobody does work for free," he said, and the way he said it told her it was not a complaint. It was an observation, and somewhere beneath it a question. "I did not say it was free," she said. "I said you do not owe me for it. There is a difference. Good work reflects on my shop. Shoddy work reflects on my shop. I do not allow shoddy work to leave my shop even if the customer only paid for shoddy." He looked at her for another long moment, and then he nodded, a single, slow dip of his chin that felt oddly significant. "Abel Barnett," he said, as if they had not already exchanged names the day before, as if he was saying it differently this time, as if he was introducing himself to someone he had decided was worth knowing. "Georgia Donnelly," she said, and extended her hand the way she extended her hand to every customer regardless of whether social convention suggested a woman ought to. It was her shop and she ran it her way. He shook it. His hand was very large and very calloused and very careful. He paid her the 60 cents and left, and Georgia went back to work and thought, for about 30 seconds before she made herself stop, that his eyes were a very unusual color. He came back 4 days later with a pair of trousers that had split at the inner seam, which was an extremely common trail hazard, and nothing she had not seen 100 times. And then a week after that with a vest that needed its lining replaced. And then again with a shirt that had lost 3 of its buttons in an incident he described tersely as a disagreement that got physical, and she replaced the buttons and did not ask about the incident. And he looked at her sideways as if he had expected her to ask, and was unsettled by the fact that she had not. By the 3rd visit, she knew several things about Abel Barnett. He had been working as a cattle drover for at least 5 years, possibly longer, because his hands and his posture and his manner of moving all told the story of a man who spent most of his life in the saddle. He was careful with money without being miserly, which suggested he had not always had it and knew better than to take it for granted. He was not a drinking man, or at least not a heavy one, because he never came in smelling of whiskey and his eyes were always clear. He was alone in the particular way of a man who had been alone long enough that it had become not just a circumstance but a philosophy. By the 4th visit, which was the shirt with the missing buttons, Patrick had stopped by the shop to drop off lunch and had given Abel a long, measuring look that Abel returned with perfect equanimity. And Patrick had pulled Georgia aside afterward and said quietly, "That one's carrying something heavy," and Georgia had said, "Most people are," and Patrick had said, "Yeah, but his is real heavy," and Georgia had said, "I know," because she did know, she had known since the first day. She did not ask about it. She was not the kind of woman who asked questions she had not been invited to ask. She understood from her own experience that some things needed to be offered rather than extracted, and she was patient, in the deliberate way of a woman who had built an entire successful business with nothing but patience and precision, and the willingness to do the work that others would not do. It was the night of the harvest social at the town hall in the 2nd week of November that things shifted between them. Georgia had made her own dress for the occasion, deep green wool with cream lace at the collar and cuffs. because she was a seamstress, and she was not about to appear at a public event in anything less than her best work. She wore her hair down for the occasion, because it was a social and not a work day, and it fell past her shoulders in dark auburn waves that she had not quite tamed with the pins she had arranged. So by midway through the evening, they were doing less architectural work than intended. Abel Barnett appeared at the social in what she immediately recognized as a freshly laundered version of the canvas coat she had repaired for him, over a white shirt that was new and a pair of dark trousers that were the ones she had received. He was clean-shaved for the occasion and looked, in Georgia's honest private assessment, entirely too good for anyone's peace of mind. He came directly across the room to where she was standing with Consolation and Lydia Harmon, which was either deliberate or the gravitational property of a man who moved straight toward whatever he intended without wasted motion. "Miss Donnelly," he said, and there was something careful and formal in it that made Lydia Harmon's eyes sharpen with interest. "Mr. Barnett," Georgia said, and introduced him to the other women with the smooth ease of someone who was never socially flustered. He spoke to Lydia Harmon with a composed sort of courtesy, and to Consolation with genuine warmth and decent Spanish, which surprised Georgia and which she filed away with everything else she was quietly noting about him. When the fiddle player started up and couples began moving toward the center of the hall, he turned to Georgia and asked, without preamble, if she would dance with him. She said yes because she wanted to, which was a simple enough reason. He was a better dancer than she expected, which was to say he was not particularly graceful, but he was completely competent, and he did not step on her feet, and he held her with the correct tension, close enough to be proper for the dance and not so close as to be impolite, though she was aware of his hand at her waist in a way that she would not have been with another man. "You look different with your hair down," he said, after they had been dancing for a minute and a half. "Different how?" she asked. He considered that for a moment with the characteristic deliberation she had come to expect from him. "Less like a woman running a business," he said. "More like a woman who might allow herself to enjoy something." Georgia looked at him steadily. "I enjoy my business," she said. "I know," he said. "That's not what I meant." They looked at each other, and the fiddle played, and the world did what it does around two people who are just beginning to understand that the distance between them is becoming something more interesting than distance. "What are you planning to do after the cattle season?" she asked, because she was practical and because she wanted to know. "Move on," he said, the same flat certainty she had heard from him before, the kind of answer that had become so automatic that it was no longer a decision. It was just a reflex. "To where?" she asked. "Wherever there's work," he said, and after that she asked. He looked at her as if the question was in a language he did not quite speak. "After that, somewhere else," he said. "Do you like it?" she asked. "The moving." He was quiet for a moment that lasted past comfortable. "I don't not like it," he said finally. Georgia understood that the space between liking something and not liking it was where a great deal of human unhappiness quietly lived. She did not say this. She filed it away. "I have been in Caldwell 2 years," she said instead. "When I came, I did not plan to stay more than 1 season. I thought I would earn enough to set Patrick up and then move further west." "What changed?" he asked, and the question had the quality of real curiosity, the kind that comes from someone who does not usually bother asking. "The work was good," she said, "and the people needed it done well. I decided there was more satisfaction in building something than in passing through something." She felt the slight change in the tension of his hand at her waist, the smallest possible contraction, like a muscle responding to a thought. He did not say anything, but he looked at her and she looked back, and the fiddle played, and something happened between them that had no precise name and required none. The weeks that followed were not a courtship in any conventional sense, because Abel Barnett was not a man who knew how to court a woman in the conventional sense, and Georgia Donnelly was not a woman who required conventional courting. What they had was better than that, or at least more honest. He began stopping by her shop in the early evenings when his work at the stockyards or the ranch where he had picked up temporary winter labor was done for the day, and he would sit in the wooden chair near her cutting table, and they would talk. He talked less than she did, but what he said was always worth listening to, and he listened to her with the complete, focused attention of someone for whom listening was a skill they had developed deliberately because they understood its value. She told him about her work, about the challenges of sourcing good fabric in a frontier town and the creative solutions she had devised, about the techniques she had taught herself from books and from a brief apprenticeship with a French-trained tailor in St. Louis who had emigrated after the war and set up shop in a somewhat unlikely location on the western edge of the city. She told him things she did not generally tell people, not because she was a secretive woman, but because most people did not ask questions that invited honest answers, and Abel asked questions that invited honesty in his spare, careful way. He told her about the road, about the years of trailing cattle up from Texas along the Kishom, about the particular quality of the sky over the Oklahoma Territory at night when the stars were thick, and the cattle were settled and quiet, and the whole world felt enormous and empty and somehow perfect. He did not romanticize it the way drifting men often did when they talked about the road, turning it into a kind of religion to justify the leaving. He spoke of it practically, analytically, as the life he had built from the materials available to him. She began to understand what Patrick had meant about the thing he was carrying. Abel Barnett's father had abandoned his family when Abel was 11 years old, walking out one morning before dawn without a word or a letter or a forwarding address, simply gone the way water is gone when it drains from a basin, absolutely and without residue. Abel had told her this in the flat, careful tone he used for things he had made peace with by sheer force of repetition, but the shape of the wound was still visible if you knew what you were looking at. He had spent his adolescence and his young manhood proving to himself that he did not need anyone, that he could survive and succeed entirely on his own terms, that roots were a liability and attachments were a weakness, because if you did not anchor yourself to anything, then nothing could be lost when the leaving came. It was a philosophy that had served him well in a life that required moving. It was also, Georgia could see with absolute clarity, a philosophy that was going to hollow him out entirely if he held to it much longer. She did not say this. She was not in the business of telling people things they were not ready to hear. She was in the business of very carefully, very patiently, doing the work that needed doing and letting the results speak for themselves. What she did, quietly, over the course of those November and December weeks, was begin to understand what Abel Barnett needed to build a life that was worth the living. And she began, with the same precision and patience with which she approached a difficult commission, to put things in place. The incident that most clearly illustrated what Georgia Donnelly was actually made of happened on a Tuesday afternoon in early December, when a rancher named Conrad Hale came into her shop. Hale was a large, loud man who owned a moderate spread 15 miles south of Caldwell, and who had been having a long-running dispute with his neighbor over a boundary line. He was also, Georgia had learned through the reliable information network of a woman who served half the town in an intimate professional capacity, deeply in debt to the Caldwell Bank and getting desperate about it. He came in that Tuesday with the particular energy of a man who has decided that aggression is the solution to anxiety, and he had a proposal. The proposal was that Georgia should sell her shop building to him, at a price he named that was roughly a third of what it was actually worth, because he knew of a buyer who was interested in the lot for a commercial purpose. He delivered this proposal with the manner of a man who was not really proposing anything, who was informing her of what was going to happen because he had already decided it and expected her to comply with the decision. Georgia listened to the entire proposal without interrupting him, which was her practice. She let him finish completely. She let the silence after he finished sit for a moment, while she continued stitching the sleeve hem she had been working on before he arrived, because she was not going to set down her work for this particular conversation. Then she looked up at him with those green eyes. "Mr. Hale," she said pleasantly, "I have owned this building outright since March of this year. The deed is registered with the county clerk. If you want to make an offer on my property, you are welcome to submit one in writing through the proper legal channels." She paused one beat. "However, I should inform you that I had the building independently appraised in September, at the recommendation of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, who are interested in securing contracts with local businesses along the proposed rail extension route. The appraised value was $1,420. If your buyer is seriously interested at a fair market price, I am happy to discuss it." Another pause. "If not, I have a sleeve hem to finish." Hale stared at her. He had the look of a man who had walked into a room expecting it to be empty and found a fully staffed office operating efficiently inside. "The railway," he repeated. "Yes," she said, and went back to her stitching. He left. He did not make an offer in writing. The lot on which her shop sat had just become significantly more valuable in the context of a railway expansion route, and everyone in the county who was anyone was going to know that within the week. Georgia had known about the railway proposal for 2 months. She had spent 3 weeks quietly gathering information, speaking with the right people, and positioning herself before the information became general knowledge. It was not luck, and it was not accident. It was the application of intelligence and preparation to a situation that other people were still trying to understand while she had already moved through it. Abel had been in the back of the shop, doing a favor for Patrick by helping move some heavy crates of supplies that had arrived from the east, and he had heard the entire exchange through the thin internal wall. He came through the connecting door after Hale was gone and stood in the doorway of the shop and looked at Georgia for a long moment that had a very particular quality to it. She glanced up at him. "He will be fine," she said. "He is bluffing through a cash problem. He will find another way." "You knew about the railway," Abel said. "It was not a question." "Since October," she said. "You knew what your building was worth," he said. "I always know what my work is worth," she said simply. "That is not arrogance, that is business." He was still standing in the doorway with that expression, and Georgia suddenly recognized what it was. She had seen it occasionally on the faces of people who had underestimated her, and then witnessed something that required them to revise their estimate. But she had never seen it quite so openly on a face as controlled and guarded as Abel Barnett's. He was genuinely, deeply, completely impressed. Not in the condescending way of a man who is surprised that a woman is competent, but in the honest way of a person who has just seen a level of skill and strategic thinking that they had not encountered before and which they respect without reservation. "Georgia Donnelly," he said slowly, and it was the second time he had said her full name like that, like he was learning what it meant. "Abel Barnett," she said back, in precisely the same tone, and went back to her sleeve hem, and let him think about whatever he was thinking about. She heard him laugh, low and brief, the first time she had ever heard him laugh, and then the sound of him going back to the crates. Christmas came to Caldwell in 1879, with a hard frost and a 3-day snowfall that shut the road to the south, and kept everyone in town closer together than they usually chose to be. Georgia decorated her shop window with a length of red ribbon and a wreath of dried prairie grass, and holly she had found growing improbably along the creek bank. Consolation brought tamales on Christmas Eve, and they shared them with Patrick and with Marshall Douglas Webb, who was a widower and ate Christmas supper where he was invited because he was practical about loneliness. Abel ate Christmas supper at Georgia's table too, because she had asked him and he had said yes, and because it was becoming natural by then, the way certain things become natural when the pattern of them has been repeated enough times that deviating from them would feel like a deliberate choice requiring justification. After supper, after Patrick had gone back to the boarding house where he lived and Consolation had gone home to her family and Marshall Webb had thanked them both with the excessive formality of a man who does not quite know what to do with warmth. Abel and Georgia sat at the small table in the back room of her shop, which served as her private sitting room and kitchen combined, and she showed him what she was working on. It was a quilt. Not an ordinary quilt, because Georgia did not do anything in an ordinary way. It was a hexagonal patchwork, the pattern called Grandmother's Flower Garden, but she was executing it in an unusual color palette, deep burgundy and gold and charcoal gray, using pieces she had saved from every interesting remnant that had come through her shop over the past 2 years. Each hexagon was cut with mathematical precision and joined with a whip stitch so fine it was nearly invisible, and the overall effect, even unfinished as it was something that stopped the eye. Abel looked at it for a long time. He reached out and touched one of the gold hexagons very carefully, with the tip of one finger, the way you touch something you want to understand. "This is not for a customer," he said. "No," she said. "For Patrick?" he asked. "No," she said, and did not offer more. He looked up at her. "For who?" She held his gaze. "I am not sure yet," she said, which was both honest and not the whole truth, and she could see him understand that and decide not to push it. He looked back at the quilt. "You think about the future a lot," he said. It was an observation, not a criticism. "All the time," she said. "Do not you?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think about the next job," he said. "The next town, the next season." "That is the future," she said. "That's not the same as what you do," he said, and she could hear him working it out as he spoke, which was unusual for him, this visible processing. "You build forward. You make things that are meant to last." "Yes," she said. He looked at her again with those gray-blue eyes. The lamplight made everything amber and soft, and the snow outside made the town quiet in the way snow always does, muffling everything, creating a temporary pocket of stillness. "I have never been in one place long enough to need something that lasts," he said. "I know," she said. "That does not bother you?" He asked, and there was something underneath the question, something raw and uncertain that she recognized as the question he was actually asking, which was not about her but about him. "Abel," she said, gently, the first time she had used just his given name without the formal mode she defaulted to in professional contexts, and the word landed between them with a weight that neither of them pretended not to notice. "What you are really asking is whether I think the way you have lived your life is something that can change, and that is not something I can answer for you." He looked at her for a very long time. The snow pressed against the windows. The lamp made its small, warm circle. "No," he said finally, "I suppose it is not." But he stayed at her table until past 10 o'clock, and he helped her clear the supper things. And when he left, he paused in the doorway of the shop and turned back and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something that had no wall behind it, something that was simply open and looking, and he said, "Thank you, Georgia," and she said, "Good night, Abel," and he left. And she stood in her shop for a long moment afterward with her hand pressed flat against the cutting table, as if she needed something to hold on to. January 1880 brought 3 things to Caldwell. The first was the formal announcement of the Santa Fe Railway extension route, which would bring a new line through Caldwell proper and several of the surrounding communities, and which confirmed what Georgia had known since October, and which sent the town into a complicated mixture of celebration and anxiety, because the railway was a transformative force, and everyone understood that some transformations are not kind to the things they transform. The second was the arrival in town of a man named Declan Rourke, who rode in from the south with a crew of 4 and set up at the best hotel and began asking questions about land parcels and business holdings, and who owned what and who was looking to sell, and who might be persuaded to sell given the right kind of pressure. He was a land speculator of the aggressive variety, the kind that followed railway announcements the way vultures follow storm clouds, and he had a way of moving through a community that left a particular kind of discomfort in his wake, like an odor that no one could precisely identify, but everyone found unpleasant. The third was that Abel Barnett, in the middle of January, during one of his evening visits to George's shop, told her that he had been offered a position. He told her about it with the contained, careful energy of a man who was not sure how he felt about what he was telling her. The position was a permanent one, as foreman of operations at a large ranch outside of Dodge City, offered by a cattle operator named Herschel Dunn, who had crossed paths with Abel 3 times over 5 years of cattle drives, and had decided that Abel was the best operations mind he had encountered on the trail. The salary was good. The position was stable. It was, by any objective measurement, the best professional opportunity Abel Barnett had ever been offered. He told her all of this, and then he went quiet, and Georgia listened to the quality of the quiet. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I am thinking on it," he said. "What is there to think about?" she asked, and she asked it without any particular inflection, genuinely curious, because from the outside the answer appeared obvious and she wanted to understand what was happening inside his thinking. He looked at the floor and then at the wall and then at her. "Foreman is a different kind of commitment than driving," he said. "It is not just passing through. It would mean settling somewhere." "In Dodge City," she said. "In Dodge City," he confirmed. A beat, she calculated. Dodge City was 60 miles north and west, not the other side of the world, not the same as staying in Caldwell. "Is it what you want?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "I'm not entirely sure what I want," he said, and the honesty of that, the naked admission from a man who had built his entire identity on self-sufficiency and certainty, landed between them like something fragile and important. Georgia set down the mending she had been doing. She looked at him directly. "Abel," she said, "I am going to say something plainly because I think you are owed plainness. I would rather keep your company than not keep it. I would rather you were in Caldwell than not in Caldwell, but I am not going to ask you to make any decision based on that. That would not be fair to you, and it would not be fair to me. What I will tell you is that whatever you decide, you should decide it for the right reasons and not the familiar ones." He stared at her. "The familiar ones," he said. "Moving because work requires it is a reason," she said. "Moving because staying is frightening is a habit dressed up as a reason. They feel the same from the inside. That is what makes them easy to confuse." The silence that followed was very long. "I have been moving for 12 years, he said. "I know," she said. "I do not know if I know how to stop," he said, and the rawness of it was so complete and so unguarded that Georgia felt something shift in her chest, the same way the world shifts very slightly when a door opens that has been closed for a very long time. "Most skills can be learned," she said, very gently. "It is just a matter of deciding they are worth learning." He left that night without telling her what he was going to decide, and Georgia sat at her table and looked at the quilt she was piecing and allowed herself, for exactly 5 minutes, to feel the weight of the uncertainty before she set it aside and thought instead about the other things she had been carefully arranging. Declan Rourke was a problem that Georgia had identified before most of the town understood the nature of what he was. She had watched the way he moved through the commercial district, the way he spoke to business owners, the combination of charm and implicit threat that was his particular instrument. She had experienced it herself when he came into her shop in the second week of January with an offer to buy her building at twice the value of Conrad Hale's offer from December, which was to say still somewhat below the actual market value given the railway development, but dressed up to seem generous. She had declined with perfect politeness, and he had left with a smile that did not reach his eyes. She went to Marshall Douglas Webb that afternoon. Webb was a thorough and honest lawman who had been Marshal of Caldwell for 4 years, and who had navigated its complicated character without either the corruption that afflicted some frontier law offices or the excessive rigidity that made other lawmen more trouble than the outlaws. She laid out for him, systematically and with the documentation she had been quietly assembling, a pattern she had identified in Rourke's methods, specifically 3 property transactions in communities on the previous stretch of the Santa Fe route, where the final outcomes had involved suspicious fires, intimidated sellers, and prices dramatically below market value filed with county clerks who had apparently been looking in another direction. She had written to the county clerk's offices in those communities herself. 3 letters sent 6 weeks earlier when she first heard rumors of the railway extension and began anticipating exactly this kind of speculation activity. The responses had come back with sufficient information to constitute a clear pattern, and she had organized the information neatly and brought it to Webb. Webb read through it with the deliberate thoroughness that was his professional habit, and then he looked up at her with an expression that was not unlike the one Abel had worn after the Conrad Hale incident. "Miss Donnelly," he said carefully, "how long have you been doing this?" "Since November," she said. "Did you know work was coming?" he said. "Not specifically," she said, "but I knew someone like him was likely. The railway makes it inevitable. I thought it was worth being prepared." Webb rubbed the side of his jaw. "I am going to write to the Federal Land Office," he said, "and I am going to have a conversation with Rourke about the nature of Caldwell's hospitality." "That seems appropriate," she said. She left the marshal's office and went back to her shop, and 2 days later Rourke and his crew were escorted out of Caldwell by Webb with a polite but entirely clear message about the sort of business practices that would not be tolerated within his jurisdiction. The businesses of Caldwell mostly did not know quite what had happened or who had made it happen. Georgia's name was not mentioned in any conversation that Georgia was aware of, because she had not asked Webb to mention it, and he had understood why without being told. Abel found out about it from Patrick, who had heard a partial version from Marshal Webb. He came to the shop the next evening with a look on his face that Georgia could not quite categorize, something that sat between admiration and something she might have called awe if awe were not too large a word for the expression on a man as contained as Abel Barnett. "Rourke is gone," he said. "Yes," she said. "Webb says you identified him before anyone else in town had the first idea," he said. "I had time to prepare," she said. "Georgia," he said, and stopped, and she waited, and he tried again. "What you did, what you built here, what you know, how you think about things. I have been thinking about what you said, about the difference between a reason and a habit dressed up as a reason." She set down what she was doing and gave him her full attention. "I told Herschel Dunn I would not take the Dodge City position," he said. Georgia held very still. "I told him I had other work under consideration," Abel said. He looked at her with those clear gray-blue eyes, and there was nothing guarded in them now, no wall, nothing between the looking and what lay behind it. "I do not know if I am right. I do not know if I can be the kind of man who builds something rather than passes through it. But I know that Caldwell is the first place I have been in 12 years where I have thought that passing through it would be a specific kind of loss." He paused. "You are the first person I have met where I have thought that very clearly." The shop was quiet. It was late January and cold outside, and the stove in the corner of the room was doing its patient work, and the lamps were lit, and everything was amber and quiet. "Abel," Georgia said, "I know I am not uncomplicated," he said. "I know I am carrying things I have not figured out how to set down yet. I am not offering you anything I cannot back with more than words." "I know," she said, "but I would like to try," he said, "if you are willing." Georgia Donnelly looked at Abel Barnett for a long, quiet moment. She thought about the quilt on her work table. She thought about the deed to the parcel of land on the south edge of town that she had secured 3 weeks ago, before any of this, because she had seen the way he looked at it, and she had understood something that he had not understood about himself yet, that he was ready to stop moving even if he did not know it. She thought about the conversation with Marshal Webb that had happened before Rourke's arrival, in which she had quietly mentioned that she thought Caldwell might be well served by a deputy with real trail experience and operational judgment, someone who knew how men worked and moved and what they were capable of, and Webb had said that was an interesting idea and he would think on it. She thought about all of it, all the careful work she had been doing not for him, not out of any presumptuous certainty about what he would choose, but because she had assessed the situation with the same clear eye she brought to every professional challenge, and she had decided to create the best possible conditions for the best possible outcome and then let things unfold the way they would. She had sewn his future, not dictated it, prepared for it, given it good fabric to work with. "Yes," she said simply. "I am willing." He crossed the shop in 3 long strides, and he took her face in those big, careful hands, and he kissed her with the same concentrated, complete attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. And Georgia Donnelly, who had been fiercely and capably managing her own life for 7 years without asking anyone's help, allowed herself to be kissed by this man, and kissed him back with a wholeness she had not known she had been withholding. February in Kansas was not romantic by any conventional measurement. It was cold and gray, and the roads were mud, and then frozen mud, and then mud again. And the wind came off the prairie with a horizontal, personal kind of hostility that made every outdoor errand feel like a minor battle. Georgia and Abel navigated February with the practical warmth of 2 people who had decided, clearly and without excessive drama, that this was the direction things were going, and who were both constitutionally unsuited to excessive drama and preferred instead to simply proceed. He still came to the shop in the evenings. He helped with heavy lifting and things that required a second pair of hands, not because she could not manage without him, but because he was there and willing, and it made things more efficient, and neither of them pretended otherwise. He had taken on a part-time position at the livery while he figured out his next steps, because Abel Barnett did not sit still, and did not depend on anyone's income but his own, which Georgia respected with a completeness that she knew he felt. In the middle of February, during one of the evenings where they were sitting at her table working separately, she on a particularly complicated bodice commission, and he writing a letter to Herschel Dunn recommending a man he knew from the trail for the Dodge City position, she told him about the land. She told him matter-of-factly, the way she told things, setting out the facts in order. She had identified the parcel in November. She had spoken to the owner, a homesteader named Pruitt, who was selling because his wife's health required them to move to a lower altitude. She had secured it in January at a fair price, paying half from her savings and arranging a note with the bank for the remainder. Abel listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You bought land," he said. "Yes," she said. "In November," he said. "Yes." "When did you first?" He stopped himself, tried again. "You saw something in November," he said slowly, "and you acted on it." "I thought it was a sound investment regardless of any other outcome," she said, which was true. "The railway makes land on the south edge of town considerably more valuable, and it is good land, good water access from the creek, good building position." He looked at her for a long time. "Georgia," he said, "are you telling me that you bought land that could support a house in a town where I was beginning to think about whether I might stay before I had told you I was thinking about it?" She met his gaze evenly. "I am telling you that I identified a sound investment opportunity and acted on it," she said. "What you do with the information is entirely your own business." The expression on his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life, a complicated, layered thing, the deep impression that had become familiar, but now threaded through with something else, something tender and wondering and slightly undone, as if she had done something that reached past all his carefully maintained defenses and simply touched the thing underneath that had always wanted to be touched. "You are the most extraordinary person I have ever met," he said. Georgia Donnelly felt the heat of it rise in her cheeks and was briefly annoyed with herself for blushing. "You have not met enough people," she said. He laughed, and this time it was a full laugh, unreserved and genuine, and it did something to his whole face, opened it up in a way that made him look younger and warmer and entirely dangerous to Georgia's continued composure. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I met exactly the right one." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the letter he had been writing. "I would like to see the land," he said, "if you are willing to show me." "Tomorrow morning," she said, "if the road is not too bad." The road was not too bad. It had been frozen overnight and held firm enough in the early morning cold, and they rode out to the south edge of town in the February light that was thin and pale and clear, Georgia on her own horse, a sturdy bay mare she had owned for a year and a half named Thursday, because she had bought her on a Thursday and lacked patience for more ornate naming conventions. The parcel was 8 acres backing to a wide, clear-running stretch of the creek, and the position of it was excellent in the way Georgia had described, elevated enough to avoid the creek flooding in a wet spring, sheltered from the northwest wind by a rise of ground, with a stand of cottonwood on the creek bank that would be magnificent in summer. There was no structure on it yet. Just the land, quiet and snow-edged and genuinely beautiful in the specific, austere way that Kansas prairie was beautiful when you looked at it honestly. Abel dismounted and stood looking at it for several minutes. Georgia watched him from horseback. She watched his face the way she always watched his face, and she saw what she had seen the first time she had observed him looking at this particular piece of ground 3 months ago, when he had not known she was paying attention. He wanted it, not just the land, the version of himself that could live on it, the life that could be built here, the permanence, the roots he had spent 12 years telling himself he did not need. He turned and looked at her on her horse, the February light behind her, and his face was completely open. "Georgia," he said, "will you marry me?" She had thought he might ask this. She had not known he would ask it today, standing in the snow at the edge of the creek land, with no ceremony or preparation, just the two of them and the horses and the cold and the extraordinary openness of the question. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He reached up and she took his hand and swung down from Thursday's back, and he caught her, and they stood in the snow with his arms around her, and she felt the solid, real weight of him, no longer a drifter, or not only a drifter, something more than that now, something beginning, and she pressed her face against the warm wool of his shoulder and breathed. "I want to build on this land," he said into her hair. "I know," she said. "I want to do it right," he said. "I want it to be permanent." "I know," she said. "I am going to need to learn how to stay," he said. "You are going to be very good at it," she said, with the same quiet certainty with which she said everything she was sure of, and she was sure of this. He held her tighter and she let herself be held, this woman who had built everything herself and needed no one, and understood that needing no one was different from choosing someone, and that choosing Abel Barnett was not a vulnerability but an addition, one strong thing meeting another, and becoming something greater than either alone. The spring of 1880 in Caldwell was wet and green and noisy with the business of change. The Santa Fe Railway crews arrived in April to begin survey work for the extension, and the town buzzed with the complicated energy of a community watching itself transform in real time, some of it exciting and some of it frightening, and all of it irreversible. Georgia's business expanded substantially as the railway workers and the new commercial activity they brought created demand she had not previously had to meet. She hired a second assistant, a young woman from the Osage community who had come to Caldwell with her family, and who had exceptional hands and a creative instinct that Georgia recognized immediately and cultivated with the same deliberate generosity with which her own skills had once been cultivated by the French-trained tailor in St. Louis. Abel, in a development that surprised some people, and surprised no one who had watched the situation carefully, was offered and accepted a position as deputy marshal of Caldwell under Douglas Webb. Webb had brought it up as if it were his own idea, which Georgia was content to let stand, because the best arrangements were often the ones where everyone involved believed they had arrived at the conclusion independently. Abel had the experience, the judgment, the physical capability, and the temperament for the work, and within a month of taking the position, it was evident to everyone in town that Caldwell had acquired something valuable. Abel found out about Georgia's conversation with Webb in April, not from Webb but from Patrick, who had a talent for knowing things he probably should not. He came to the shop on the evening of the day he found out, and he stood in the doorway with his badge on his coat and his hat in his hand, and he looked at her with an expression that was complicated and warm and not the least bit angry. "You spoke to Webb about me," he said. "I mentioned that I thought Caldwell might benefit from a deputy with trail experience," she said carefully. "I did not speak about you specifically." "Georgia," he said. "I mentioned it in October," she said, "before anything between us had been said or decided." It was a general observation about the town's needs. He was quiet for a moment. "In October," he said. "Yes," she said. He shook his head slowly, and there was something in his expression that was close to helpless, in the best possible way, the way a man looks when he realizes that the person he loves has been several steps ahead of him the entire time and he has not the slightest complaint about it. "How much of my life have you arranged?" he asked. She considered this honestly. "Very little," she said. "I arranged conditions. You made every choice yourself." "The land," he said. "A sound investment," she said. "Webb," he said. "A general observation," she said. "And me believing that staying in Caldwell was my own idea," he said. Georgia looked at him with those clear green eyes. "Staying in Caldwell was entirely your own idea," she said with absolute sincerity. "I never told you to stay. I never asked you to stay. I created no obligation. I simply believed it was a possibility worth preparing for." She paused. "I was a seamstress before I was anything else, Abel. I make patterns. I cut the fabric, but you are the one who wore the coat." He crossed the shop and took her hands in his and looked at her from very close, all that controlled intensity directed at her with nothing held back. "I love you," he said. It was the first time he had said it, and he said it the way he did everything, plainly and completely, without hedging or decoration. And Georgia felt it land in her chest like something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. "I love you," she said back, equally plain, equally complete, and kissed him. They were married in June of 1880, in the church on the west side of Caldwell's Main Street, with Patrick standing at George's side and Marshall Webb standing at Abel's, and Consolation catching George's bridal bouquet of prairie wildflowers while making a face that suggested she was not entirely comfortable with the social convention, but was willing to participate as a courtesy. George's dress was, naturally, her own work. She had spent 3 weeks on it, and it was the finest single garment she had ever made. Ivory silk she had ordered specially from a merchant in Kansas City, cut and constructed with the technical perfection of 7 years of professional mastery, and the additional care of someone making something intended to matter for a long time. Abel, when he saw her come down the aisle on Patrick's arm, went very still in the way that entirely composed men go still when something has moved past their defenses completely, and Georgia watched his face change and loved him for letting her see it. The preacher said the words, and they said the words back, and the church smelled of June heat and candle wax and wildflowers. And when the preacher said Abel could kiss his bride, Abel took Georgia's face in both hands the way he had that first time in the shop, and kissed her with the full weight of everything between them. All the months of careful approach and honest conversation and mutual recognition. All the careful threads she had woven and the authentic choice he had made. And the congregation made a sound of warm approval. Caldwell gave them a wedding celebration at the town hall that lasted until nearly midnight, with dancing and food and the particular joyful chaos of a frontier community that has decided this is a day worth celebrating. Patrick danced with Consolation twice and looked extremely proud of himself, and Webb drank 3 glasses of punch and made a speech that was extremely sincere and approximately 4 sentences too long, and Georgia danced with Abel until her feet protested, and then sat with him at the side of the room with his arm around her, and felt, with a simple and complete certainty, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. They began building on the south parcel in July, hiring a contractor from Wichita who brought a crew and used local lumber and stone to put up a proper house, 2 stories, 4 rooms, with a wide front porch facing the creek and a good solid root cellar, and a workshop space that Georgia planned to use for a secondary sewing operation. for the larger commissions that her expanded business increasingly required. Abel, who had spent 12 years in the saddle and had a profound practical understanding of structure and load, and what things needed to last, worked alongside the contractor's crew on every day he was not required for his duties as deputy, learning the work with the same focused thoroughness he applied to everything. And within 6 weeks, the contractor told Georgia privately that her husband had the instincts of a natural builder, and she should put him to work on something whenever she could spare him. Georgia smiled and said she was not at all surprised and thanked him for confirming it. They moved into the house in September, on a warm afternoon that smelled of fresh-cut wood and prairie grass and the late summer creek, and Georgia stood in the front room with the afternoon light coming through the new windows and felt the floors beneath her feet and listened to the house settle and breathe around her, and knew that this was a place that was going to hold a life. Abel came and stood behind her and put his arms around her and his chin on the top of her head, and they stood together looking at the room. "It is real," he said, and she understood that he meant more than the house. "It is real," she agreed. "I did not know I wanted this," he said, "not the way I know it now." "I know," she said. "You knew before I did," he said. She laughed quietly. "I knew it was possible," she said. "There is a difference." He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "However you want to call it," he said. They were quiet together for a moment in the new house, in the afternoon light, in the life they had built. "Georgia," he said. "Yes, thank you," he said, "for not telling me what to choose, for just making it worth choosing." She turned in his arms and looked up at him. "Thank you," she said, "for being willing to learn something new." He kissed her, slow and warm, in the afternoon light of the house that was theirs. The first year of their marriage was everything that real life is, which is to say it was not seamless or uncomplicated or exclusively romantic, because no first year of marriage is, and neither Georgia nor Abel was the kind of person who needed it to be. It was full and real and good. Abel's work as deputy was demanding and occasionally dangerous, because Caldwell in 1880 and 1880, one was still a border town with real border town character, and the railway expansion brought new people and new money, and some of both were not welcome additions. He was a very good deputy, careful and firm and unflinching when necessary and judicious about when necessary actually was, and Webb began talking within 6 months about the possibility of Abel taking over the full marshal's role, when Webb reached the age at which he had decided he would retire, which he said was 60, which was 2 years away. Abel said he would think about it, and he did think about it, and Georgia watched him think about it with the same quiet attention she had always given to the workings of his mind, and she said very little because very little was required. He already knew what he thought. He just needed the space to confirm it. He told Webb yes in February of 1881. Georgia expanded her shop in the spring of that year, taking on the adjacent space that became available when the barber relocated to larger premises on the north end of the block. She put her second assistant, whose name was Lena, in charge of the standard repair and alteration work that formed the steady bread and butter of the business, freeing Georgia for the complex commissions and the business management and the private work she had been quietly developing, which was a correspondence relationship with several clothing merchants in Kansas City and Wichita who were interested in quality custom pieces for their wealthier clientele. She had also, in January of 1881, begun writing a guide to frontier tailoring, a practical manual aimed at the women throughout the Kansas and Oklahoma territories who were doing textile work with limited resources and limited access to formal training. She wrote it in the evenings at the kitchen table in the house by the creek, with Abel reading law and procedure manuals across the table from her, both of them working in the comfortable parallel silence of people who are entirely at ease in each other's company. She had not told anyone about the guide yet except Abel, who had read the first 3 sections and told her with complete seriousness that it was the clearest and most practical technical writing he had ever read, and that she should find a way to have it printed and distributed, and she had looked at him and felt a specific, warm pride that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with being known. Their first child came into the world in the autumn of 1881, a boy they named Thomas after Abel's grandfather, the only member of Abel's family he spoke of with uncomplicated warmth, a man who had been a blacksmith and a steady, principled presence in Abel's early childhood before his father's leaving had broken the pattern of things. Thomas was a solid, dark-haired baby with his mother's green eyes and his father's serious expression, and the combination was so immediately appealing that even Consolation, who maintained a general skepticism about infants, admitted that this particular specimen was exceptional. Abel, who had never spent any significant time around children and had quietly harbored a fear he had not expressed to Georgia, that he might not know how to be a father given that his own had not been present to demonstrate it, discovered in the delivery room of the house, by the creak, that the fear was entirely unfounded. He held Thomas with the same careful, complete attention he gave to everything that mattered, and when the baby closed his tiny fist around Abel's thumb and refused to let go, something crossed Abel Barnett's face that Georgia witnessed and stored in the permanent and private treasury of moments that constituted the real shape of her life. He looked, for just an instant, like a man who understood with his whole body what it meant to have arrived somewhere. Georgia was back at work 6 weeks after Thomas was born, because the business required her and she required the business, and because she had arranged, with characteristic forethought, a situation in which Consolation's younger sister, who was looking for work, took on the role of helping in the house during the daytime hours. Abel adjusted his schedule so that he was home in the mornings, and they managed it the way they managed everything, practically and with mutual honesty, and a complete absence of the kind of gendered assumptions that might have made the arrangement more complicated. Patrick, now 21 and working as a junior buyer at one of the cattle commission houses in Caldwell, was an enthusiastic uncle who arrived on Sunday afternoons with small carved wooden toys of questionable artistic merit and an unlimited willingness to make faces at Thomas until Thomas laughed. Abel watched Patrick with Thomas, and his face softened in a way that Georgia found deeply moving, because she knew that what he was watching was the kind of easy, present, loving male attention that he had been denied in his own childhood, and that witnessing it in his own family was a form of healing that was working on him quietly and persistently and well. The winter of 1881 into 1882 brought a particular trial to Caldwell that tested everything Georgia and Abel had built, and it came in the form of a man named James Crabtree. Crabtree arrived in October of 1881 as the new bank manager, replacing the previous one who had retired. He was smooth and well-dressed and carried references from a financial institution in St. Louis that, Georgia noted, was one she had some indirect knowledge of from her years in that city. She could not have told anyone exactly what triggered the first note of unease she felt about him. It was a compound thing, the quality of his smoothness, which was too uniform, the way he spoke about financial matters, which had the fluency of someone who had practiced the language without fully understanding the underlying principles, and a specific, small inconsistency she noticed in a conversation she overheard at the Mercantile, where he described the same loan policy 2 different ways to 2 different people within 10 minutes. She began doing what she had done before. Quietly, systematically, she gathered information. She wrote to a contact she had maintained in St. Louis, a woman who had been her mother's closest friend, and who was now the wife of a lawyer with extensive commercial connections. She wrote a careful letter asking for any information about the financial institution named on Crabtree's references. She wrote to the county land office. She made certain inquiries through Webb, framed as general questions about bank regulatory practices, that sent Webb down a chain of procedural thinking that led him to make several inquiries of his own. The picture that assembled itself over the course of November and December was not pleasant. Crabtree was working a systematic fraud that involved creating small, obscure inconsistencies in the bank's lending records that would allow him to siphon funds slowly, and in amounts that would not be obvious on casual quarterly review. It was a sophisticated operation that required real financial knowledge to identify, and would not have been caught for another year at minimum without someone actively looking. Georgia brought the complete picture to Abel in January, laid out in writing on their kitchen table, every thread of evidence organized and documented. He read through it once, quickly. Then he read through it again, slowly. Then he looked up at her. "How long have you been doing this?" he said, and it was nearly the same question Webb had asked her 2 years earlier. "Since October," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I am the marshal," he said. "I know," she said. "You should have told me sooner," he said. "I needed the full picture before I brought it to you," she said. "Suspicion is not evidence. I would not put you in the position of acting on suspicion." He was quiet for a moment, and then he exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "Show me exactly what you have." She showed him. He asked precise, intelligent questions. By the end of the conversation, he had a complete operational understanding of the fraud and a clear prosecutorial picture. And 2 days later, in coordination with the county sheriff and a representative of the state bank regulatory authority, whom Abel had summoned with commendable speed, James Crabtree was arrested. The fraud was formally documented, and the bank's books were placed in protective custody pending appointment of a new manager. Caldwell's depositors were protected. The losses, which had been small because the fraud had been identified early, were recovered. Crabtree went to Wichita to stand trial and was convicted in the spring. Abel got public credit for the arrest, because he was the marshal and that was entirely appropriate. He told Webb what Georgia had done, because he was constitutionally incapable of taking credit for another person's work. And Webb shook his head slowly in the manner of a man who has decided to simply accept certain extraordinary things about certain extraordinary people without trying to fully comprehend them. In the privacy of their house by the creek, Abel held Georgia and said into her hair, "You never stop." "Would you want me to?" she asked. "No," he said. "Never." "Good," she said. "Then stop being surprised." He laughed and held her tighter. The Guide to Frontier Tailoring was published in the spring of 1882 by a printer in Kansas City, who had been recommended to Georgia by one of her merchant contacts. She had funded the printing herself and arranged distribution through the network of general merchandise stores along the Santa Fe Railway route, and through a relationship she had developed with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which had an active distribution network throughout the Kansas and Oklahoma territories. The response was immediate and substantial. Within 3 months, she was receiving letters from women throughout the region, practical letters full of specific questions and gratitude and accounts of how the techniques she had described had changed what was possible for them in their work. She answered every letter personally, because she believed in the obligation of those who had knowledge to share it, and because her own path had been shaped by those who had been willing to teach her, and she understood the weight of that debt. Abel read some of the letters when she would share them, and his expression was always the same, that deep, genuine impression that she had come to love as one of her favorite things about him. He was the kind of man who could be moved by someone else's excellence without being diminished by it, and that was rarer than any other quality she valued in him. The Guide went to a second printing by the fall of 1882. A professor at a women's college in Ohio wrote to inquire about using portions of it in a course on practical domestic economy. Georgia wrote back and gave permission and suggested 3 additional topics that would complement the existing material, and the professor wrote again to say she was incorporating the suggestions and asking if Georgia had ever considered lecturing. Georgia had not considered lecturing. She considered it then briefly, and decided it was not the right time, which was a judgment based on the fact that she was pregnant again, and Thomas was 18 months old, and the shop was expanding, and Abel had just taken on a significant case involving a land dispute and a missing deed that was consuming his attention. She wrote back to the professor and said perhaps in a future year, and put the letter in a box where she kept things for future years. The second child was a girl born in the spring of 1883, named Elena after George's mother. Elena arrived into the world with an attitude of decisive authority that had the attending doctor and consolation, who was present as Georgia had wanted her to be, looking at each other with an expression of mutual recognition. Thomas, who was 2 years old and had his father's serious disposition about most things, regarded his new sister with a cautious respect that was entirely appropriate given the quality of her early communication style. Abel held Elena the way he had held Thomas, with that same complete, careful attention, and he looked at his daughter and then at his wife, and Georgia, who was tired and pleased and entirely herself even in the immediate aftermath of childbirth, smiled at him. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "She is going to be something," he said. "She is already something," Georgia said. He laughed and pressed his lips to Georgia's temple. "You both already were," he said, "from the beginning." The years settled into the shape of a life lived fully and well. Caldwell changed, because the West was changing, the open range giving way to fenced land and the railway changing the economics of cattle and the frontier pushing further west, until it was no longer quite a frontier in the old sense. And the town adapted, as towns do, some things gained and some things lost, and the community reshaping itself around the new reality. Abel served as Marshal of Caldwell for 7 years, building a reputation that extended well beyond the county, for a kind of law enforcement that was firm without being brutal, that treated all people within his jurisdiction with the same consistent standard regardless of their station or origin, that addressed the underlying conditions of disorder alongside its immediate expressions. He was offered positions in larger cities twice, and declined both times without particular difficulty, because Caldwell was his, and he knew what he had built here, and he was not interested in elsewhere. Georgia's tailoring business grew and transformed, moving from primarily retail work toward the merchant relationships and the design consultancy that was more interesting to her and more suited to her particular gifts. She took on apprentices regularly, always women, always chosen for their intelligence and their willingness to work hard, and several of them went on to establish their own successful operations, a fact that gave Georgia a specific and quiet satisfaction that was different from any satisfaction she took in her own success. The Guide to Frontier Tailoring went to 5 printings over 8 years, and was eventually adopted as a reference text by 3 educational institutions, which astonished everyone except Georgia, who had written it with exactly that kind of use in mind, and had simply waited for the world to catch up with her intention. Patrick married Consolation in 1884, in the same church where Abel and Georgia had married 4 years earlier, and the wedding was a warm and somewhat chaotic celebration that spilled out of the church into the street, and continued at the town hall until midnight. And Georgia cried during the ceremony in a manner that surprised no one who knew how much she loved her brother, and how much she had come to regard Consolation as one of the essential people in her life. Abel stood beside Georgia during that ceremony with her hand in his, and felt the texture of what they had built, the web of connection and love and mutual investment that surrounded them, and he thought about the man he had been in October of 1879, riding into Caldwell with a torn coat, and a philosophy of needing no one and no plan more specific than the next job in the next town, and he thought about the accumulated evidence of the years since then. Thomas and Elena and the house by the creek and George's hands in his, and he understood something that he could not have articulated in the language available to him at 29, but that was very clear to him at 33. The things worth having were never the things that cost nothing. The things worth having were the things that required you to be willing to change, to admit that you had been wrong, to stand still long enough for roots to take hold. He had believed for 12 years that needing no one was strength. And Georgia Donnelly, seamstress of Caldwell, Kansas, with her needle and her thread and her extraordinary, patient, precise intelligence, had shown him, quietly and without ever pressing the point, that choosing someone was a completely different thing from needing them, that it was not weakness but the most deliberate form of courage. He squeezed her hand during Patrick's and Consolation's vows, and she squeezed back without looking at him, because she was watching her brother's face, and he looked at her profile in the church light and felt the full weight of his own good fortune. Thomas, at 5, had developed an absolute passion for the horses at the livery, and spent every available hour in their company, and already rode with a confidence, an ease that his father watched with pride and his mother watched with the practicality of a woman who knew that the prairie was a more forgiving classroom than the street, and that this was probably fine. Eleanor, at 2, had opinions about everything and expressed them clearly, and showed every indication of being exactly what Abel had predicted on the day of her birth, something quite specific and remarkable. Georgia was working on a commission that autumn of 1885 that was the most technically demanding piece of her career. A formal court presentation gown for the daughter of a wealthy Wichita merchant who was being presented in Denver society, and who had been referred to Georgia by 3 different sources, all of whom had described her as the finest seamstress between Kansas City and San Francisco. The compliment was one Georgia accepted with the same equanimity with which she accepted everything, which was to say she noted it, considered its accuracy, decided it was approximately correct, and went back to work. Abel came home on a Thursday evening in October while she was working on the bodice of the presentation gown, the lamp turned high, her reading spectacles on because the beadwork required them now, Thomas in bed and Eleanor, recently persuaded toward the same destination, after a negotiation that Eleanor had conducted with remarkable diplomatic sophistication for a 2-year-old. He sat down across from her and watched her work for a few minutes in the comfortable silence that was one of her favorite things about their evenings, and then he said, "I got a letter from my father today." Georgia looked up from the beadwork carefully, setting down the needle first. Abel's face was neutral in the particular way it was neutral when he had been processing something for several hours and had arrived at a position he was comfortable with. He had his father's letter on the table in front of him, an envelope that had been handled enough to show it, which told her he had read it multiple times on the walk home. "What did he say?" she said. "He is in Colorado," Abel said. "He is old and he is not well, and he says he thought I should know." He paused. "He does not ask for anything." Georgia waited. "He says he knows he does not have the right to ask for anything," Abel said. Georgia looked at her husband. 22 years of absence. 22 years of the wound that had made him the man who moved through 12 years of roads because staying was what his father had done before leaving. She understood the weight of what was in that letter without being told. "What do you want to do?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to write back," he said. "I think I want to write back. I do not know what I want to say yet." "You have time to think about it," she said. "He is not well," he said. "You still have time," she said gently. "You do not have to know tonight." He looked at her. "I am not going to pretend it is simple," he said. "No," she agreed. "It is not simple." He reached across the table and she gave him her hand and he held it. "Tell me something," he said. "Tell me about the dress." She told him about the dress. About the specific challenge of the beadwork pattern at the neckline, which was French in style and required a technique she had adapted from a description in a reference book, because she had never had occasion to practice it before and had spent a week working it out on scraps before touching the actual fabric. About the way the silk moved and how she had to account for that movement in the construction so the seams did not pull. About the client, a young woman named Frances who was 20 and nervous about Denver society, and who had come with her mother for 2 fittings already, and who was, Georgia thought, considerably more interesting than she believed herself to be, which was a common condition in young women who had been taught to be decorative rather than capable. Abel listened to all of it, as he always listened to her, with complete and genuine attention, and his face settled as she talked, the way it had always settled in the particular warmth of her company. And when she finished, he said, "You are going to write the letter for a follow-on order for her so that Frances has a reason to come back, are you not?" Georgia smiled. "I was thinking about it," she said. He shook his head slowly. "Always 3 steps ahead," he said. "Someone has to be," she said. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, and Georgia looked at him across the lamp and the silk and the beadwork, and felt the uncomplicated, profound happiness of a life that had been built with care and was full and real and good. He did write to his father. The correspondence was slow and careful, and carried the weight of 2 decades of absence and the complicated work of 2 people. A father who had made an irreversible wrong, and a son who had spent his whole adult life surviving the consequences, trying to find a language for something that had no easy language. Abel went to Colorado once, in the spring of 1886, a journey he made alone because he needed it to be his own thing, his own reckoning, and Georgia saw him off and took care of their children and their home and their business, and did not crowd the space he needed for this particular work. He came back 3 weeks later looking older and quieter and somehow lighter, as if something that had been pressed into him for 20 years had been released, imperfectly, partially, but enough. His father died that summer. Abel was not with him, but he was at peace with that, or at least he was working his way there with the same patient determination he brought to anything that required real effort. Georgia held him on the night he got the news and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would improve on silence and presence, and this was something she understood as clearly as she understood the structure of a French seam. The autumn of 1887 brought 2 things that felt, in retrospect, like the natural completion of an arc. The first was that Georgia's Guide to Frontier Tailoring was formally recommended by the Kansas State Board of Education as a supplementary resource for women's vocational programs, which was a recognition that arrived with a letter from Topeka, and which Georgia read twice, and then posted on the wall of her shop, because Consolation insisted it should be posted somewhere visible, and Georgia could not find a reason to argue. The second was that Abel retired from the marshal's office at 38, not because he was old or finished, but because he had been approached about a different kind of work entirely. A coalition of cattle ranchers and railway interests had been working to establish a mediation process for the increasingly complex land and commercial disputes that accompanied the territory's development, and they needed someone who understood both the frontier's culture and the law's requirements, and who had the respect of all parties. Abel's name had been proposed by 4 different people independently, which was the kind of consensus that was difficult to argue with. He came home and told Georgia about it at the kitchen table, in the lamplight that was one of the constants of their life, and she listened and asked 3 precise questions and then said, "You should do it. You think?" He said, though his eyes told her he had already decided. "You have been thinking past the marshal's role for 2 years," she said. "This is what comes next." He looked at her with a slight, warm smile. "You knew before I said it," he said. "I notice things," she said. "Georgia," he said. "Abel," she said. He reached across and tucked a piece of hair behind her ear with one careful hand, the same hand that had shaken hers 8 years ago in her shop on his second visit, large and calloused and careful, and she turned her face slightly into his touch the way she always did. "You sewed this," he said. "All of it. You saw it before it was there, and you made the fabric for it, and you let me believe I was making my own choices." "You were making your own choices," she said very sincerely. "I just made sure the fabric was good." "Is there a difference?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "The difference is that you could have chosen otherwise at every point, and I was prepared for that too. I was not certain. I was only prepared." He looked at her for a long moment. "What were you prepared to do?" he said. "If I had ridden out that January and not come back," she was quiet for a moment. "I would have been very sorry," she said, "and then I would have done exactly what I have done. Built the business, published the guide, raised Thomas and Alina." She paused, "But I would not have been as happy." "No," he said. "Neither would I." He kissed her then, slowly and thoroughly, in the kitchen of the house by the creek that they had built together from a piece of land she had bought because she had seen what he could not yet see in himself. And she kissed him back with the full and uncomplicated joy of a woman who had never needed rescuing, and had simply chosen to love someone, which was the far braver and more interesting thing. The years that followed were the long, rich years that good beginnings grow into when they are tended with care. Thomas grew into a young man who was serious and steady, and had his mother's precision and his father's quiet strength, and who was by the time he was 12 the best young horseman in Caldwell County, which surprised no one who had watched him at 5 at the livery. Alina grew into a young woman who had opinions about everything and was correct about most of them, and who had, by the time she was 10, read every book in George's considerable library twice and begun asking for more. She took to the sewing work with her mother's technical gift and her grandmother's name, and none of her grandmother's traditional expectations about what that name obligated her to become. Patrick and Consolation had 3 children, and the households by the creek and at Patrick's place on the north edge of town were the kind of adjacent, overlapping family spaces that made the fabric of daily life richer and louder, and more complicated in the best ways. Sunday suppers and shared harvests and children running between the 2 properties, with the freedom of small people who know that all the adults around them are fundamentally on their side. Abel's mediation work took him away from Caldwell sometimes, for periods of days or occasionally weeks, and Georgia managed his absence the way she managed everything, with practical efficiency and without drama, though the evenings were quieter when he was gone and the house felt slightly less itself. He always came back with stories, because the work required him to sit at tables where the West's transformation was being negotiated in real time, cattle interests and farming interests and railway interests, and the communities of people who had been on this land longest of all and whose interests were the most frequently overlooked and the most important. And he brought Georgia the stories, and she listened with the same focused attention she had always given to things that mattered. They had a 3rd child in the spring of 1890, when Georgia was 35 and Abel was 40, and both of them old enough to understand that this was a gift rather than a given. A boy named William, whom Thomas regarded with the protective seriousness of a 14-year-old who has unexpectedly been given a significant responsibility, and whom Alina regarded with a frank scientific curiosity that the baby seemed to find generally acceptable. The morning William was a week old, and Georgia was sitting up in their bed in the room that faced the creek, feeding him in the early light while Abel slept beside her, still and quiet and entirely present even in sleep in the way that had always been one of her favorite things about him. Georgia looked out at the cottonwood trees along the creek bank, and thought about October of 1879, about the man who had come through her door with a torn coat and a philosophy of solitude, and about the woman she had been, fiercely capable and entirely alone in the specific way of someone who had never been given reason to be otherwise. She thought about what she had sewn, not just the coat. Everything after it, the deliberate creation of conditions in which the best possible future could grow, not from certainty about what would happen but from faith in what was possible if the fabric was good and the work was honest and the hands were steady. William made a small sound and she looked down at him, this small and complete new person, and felt the continuity of it all, her mother's name on her daughter, her husband's grandfather's name on her eldest son, the creek running the same as it always had, the cottonwoods the same, the prairie the same, and everything within it changed and changing and full. Abel stirred beside her and opened his eyes, those gray-blue eyes that she had first looked into 40 years of life ago, sharp and watchful and entirely his. He looked at her and at William, and his face made the expression it always made in these moments, that open, unguarded warmth that she had spent a long time patiently waiting to see and that she had never once taken for granted. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He reached across and touched William's head with one careful finger, and then took George's free hand and held it. "Happy?" he asked. She looked at the creek and the cottonwoods and the morning and felt the solid weight of her life around her, the house and the work and the children and this man beside her, everything she had prepared for and everything that had surprised her, and all of it good, all of it real. "Yes," she said, "completely." The sun came up over the Kansas prairie, painting everything gold, and the creek ran on. And Abel Barnett, who had once believed with his whole life that he needed no one to succeed, held his wife's hand in the house she had helped build on the land she had bought before he knew he wanted it, and understood, with the full and unhurried certainty of a man who has finally stopped moving, that the most extraordinary journey he had ever made was the one that brought him here, to this woman, to this life, to this morning. And Georgia Donnelly, seamstress, businesswoman, writer, mother, wife, one of the fiercest and most capable people ever to make her home on the Kansas frontier, looked at her husband and her new son and the October light on the creek, and was, by every honest measurement, exactly where she had always intended to be. She had seen the pattern early. She had cut the fabric with care. She had stitched the seams with precision and patience and absolute faith in the quality of the work. And the garment, in the end, had been more beautiful than even she had imagined it could be.